This lecture is a beast. Hang in there. In fact, I've made the outline more detailed as we go along. It can't fit all on one screen. So this is a good one to download so you can follow along. I'll start by picking up the thread of political history. One goal of the Missouri Compromise of 1820 had been to predetermine the question of slavery as new states entered the Union. Everything above the 3630 line would be free, except Missouri, while everything below would have the right to establish slavery in the new state. But manifest destiny and westward expansion strained the political system and made everything worse in the emerging rift between North and South. Between 1820 and 1860, several episodes demonstrate this system under strain, reaching a series of crises in quick succession in the 1850s. It's this political strain and series of crises that I'm going to talk about today. It will take me a while to even get to the 1850s, and this is a long lecture. But the stress and strain built up over time and burst out in the 1850s, eventually ending in the bloody Civil War that started after Lincoln's election in 1860 at the end of the decade. So come along with me through the immediate causes of the Civil War for the generation that actually fought in it. One episode of strain between North and South came in the form of Texas. Yay, some Texas history for us. Since 1821 and the independence of Mexico from Spain, the area of our state had been the Mexican North. In 1824, Mexico ratified its own constitution. And just as the Mexican Revolution for Independence drew on the experience of the United States, so too with the founding documents and the Mexican Constitution. There were Federalists who believed in a strong centralized government, and Centralists who wanted to go further in that direction. They liked the idea of a monarch or a dictator, a very powerful executive leader. And since 1835, those Centralists had been in power in Mexico. By that time, by 1835, with American settlers streaming into Mexico, the Mexican government feared losing control over its own territories and settlers in the far northern frontier, in Texas. So, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, the centralist dictator of Mexico, abolished slavery in Mexico. This angered the American settlers, who viewed the region as the manifest destiny of their dreams, a place to grow cotton using slave labor on plantations, as they had done across the rest of the American South. They're very frank about what they wanted, these American Southerners in the past. They knew they were fighting for their right to own human property. The American settlers outnumbered Mexicans in the Texas province, and if they weren't enslaved and powerless, they were mostly slave owners or ambitious to achieve that status. The Texans declared their independence from Mexico on March 2nd, 1836. Santa Anna led a large army across the Rio Grande, but his march through the Mexican North was stopped short by the vigorous defense by the Americans at the Alamo. Although the Americans retreated, and Sam Houston actually fled the Alamo, nonetheless, his retreat led the Mexican forces to the furthest extent of their supply line, then cut them off. Houston's army captured Santa Anna and achieved Texas independence on April 21st, 1836. For the next 10 years, both sides claimed the region belonged to themselves. Both Mexico and Texas thought they controlled the region. The Texans had actually sought to become a state of the United States, but they had been stymied by anti-slavery forces, since slavery was already so well established in the territory, even though it was illegal according to Mexican law. So, therefore, admitting Texas as a state would have thrown off the balance in the Senate. Texas was slave territory, despite Mexican law. And this had been one of the reasons its Anglo settlers had pushed for their independence. And this commitment to slavery meant its entry into the Union would throw off the balance in the Senate. So the U.S. waited, and this explains the period of the independent Republic of Texas. Like so much else in the history of the U.S., between independence and the Civil War, the underlying issue was slavery. But as U.S. national politics shifted during the 1840s, it changed the equation regarding Texas. It's in the 1840s that the second-party system, the Whigs versus the Democrats, really began to fall apart. Let's look at the results of the 1844 presidential election. Henry Clay was the candidate of the Whigs. Remember, he's the senator from Kentucky who had crafted the Missouri Compromise, and he had been Secretary of State under John Quincy Adams. That had been the corrupt bargain that Andrew Jackson had decried and that had eventually propelled him into the presidency as head of the Democratic Party. In 1844, Clay ran for president again on the Whig side. He practically founded the Whig Party, too, but that's another story. And the Democrats nominated James K. Polk, who won dramatically. Look here, Polk has just 50% of the popular vote. But a landslide in the Electoral College with 62% of the Electoral College vote. He won the election by using strong martial language, threatening war with Britain, the old evil empire, concerning the border between Canada and the United States, where Oregon would end and Canada begin. I told you that expansion was moving in all directions, north and south as well as west. And here's an example, 54-40 or fight! That was one of the sayings of the Polk campaign. Polk and the Democrats wanted the U.S. to expand into the north, all the way to the 54-degree 40-minute line, claiming most of the inhabited parts of Canada as part of the United States. Of course, after the election, the Oregon issue soon faded. But it seemed to provide the new administration a mandate for expansion in general, if not up into Canada and up to the 54-40 line as they had promised. The Oregon issue quickly disappeared, but the mandate for expansion spilled over into the administration's rapid annexation of Texas. The U.S. annexed Texas as a state at the end of February 1845. Santa Anna, dictator of the territory, quite naturally considered this an act of war. Negotiations, the Slidell Mission, broke down on March 28, 1846, when the U.S. Army arrived at the mouth of the Rio Grande River on the border between Texas, just annexed to the U.S., and Mexico, which still believed it owned the region, now held by the U.S. Army, as part of its own nation. It's an open question, debated and not yet decided by historians about what exactly the U.S. Army was doing down there. The government claimed that they were deployed in order to defend Texas's American settlers. But it looked like a big army massing on the border with Mexico, inside it or outside, as a preparation for an invasion, or to force a war. Was this the government using the military to add a new state to the Union? Texas? A slave state? Upsetting the balance in the Senate with no debate, just a simple act of annexation. Given the power of the South in the federal government, such an argument can't be denied. Historians will keep on arguing, I'm sure. Regardless of the cause, the effect was war. And the Mexican War was kind of a warm-up for the Civil War to come. Many of the most important generals of the Civil War received their military experience in the field because of the Mexican War. Winfield Scott, Jefferson Davis, Braxton Bragg, these men made their names in the Mexican War, and their experiences and reputations shaped the American Civil War a few decades later. On April 25th, 1846, Mexico's army crossed the Rio Grande and engaged in battle with the U.S. troops. In response, the U.S. Army swelled with volunteers, 20,000 new enlistments almost immediately. Some of these were Americans, but some of them were Mexican Federalists who wanted to fight the centralist power. Perhaps they felt threatened by the Mexican anti-slavery laws. Or perhaps this was just a civil war for them, with American involvement. As we've seen since the beginning of the semester, the American strategy to colonize Mexico, or the Texas part of it, was to divide the native population and take advantage of their divisions in the society they wished to control. So, just as when the Spaniards had first conquered Mexico, so with the U.S. efforts to do the same. Divide and conquer. General Winfield Scott sailed his army of 12,000 soldiers to a beach just south of Veracruz. And from there he marched on Mexico City, which he conquered and seized on September 14th, 1847. Seizing the capital meant that the war would soon be won, securing Texas as a new state, a state with slavery, something the abolitionists of the North would obviously oppose. The abolitionists had already taken steps in the U.S. Congress to try to prevent the addition of new slave states that would tilt the federal government toward pro-slavery policies. While Winfield Scott was marching the U.S. Army toward Mexico City, David Wilmot, a Democrat from Pennsylvania, once again put forward his famous proviso of 1846 that was intended to forbid slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico. David Wilmot had been trying again and again to put forward his bill to prevent slavery in the Mexican cessions of land, which made him the enemy of the Southerners in his party. He kept putting forth the bill and forcing votes, which Southern Democrats couldn't abide. His efforts brought to the surface the split in the Democratic Party between South and North, slave and free state interests. So while the Democrats kept winning the presidency, the party was nonetheless breaking apart its sectional divisions over the issue of slavery. Southern Democrats wouldn't support an anti-slavery proviso like that, but the Democrats who represented northern states were also divided over the issue of slavery. The Wilmot Proviso, intended to prevent slavery in new territories acquired during the war with Mexico, was supported by some northern Democrats, the radical abolitionists called barn burners. But not all northern Democrats were abolitionists. There were other northern Democrats, mostly from the Old Northwest, the region opened up by the Erie Canal, who were more like the Whigs, supporters of internal improvements and state banks. These Northwestern Democrats were called doughfaces, and they minimized the issue of slavery. These nicknames are like the subgroups within the political parties today, the Blue Dog Democrats or the Log Cabin Republicans, or the Tea Party or the Never Trumpers, and so on. With the Democratic Party in disarray, we see that the U.S. war with Mexico was shaped by domestic U.S. politics, even as domestic U.S. politics was shaped by the war. The Wilmot Proviso brought out the cracks and divisions within the Democratic Party. The issue was slavery in the new territories, and it made the Democratic Party weaker, as it had different constituencies with different interests. But the war was a victory for the United States, which signed a treaty with Mexico, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, on February 2, 1848. In this Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico ceded to the U.S. all of California and New Mexico, and recognized the U.S. annexation of Texas. This is called the Mexican Cession because Mexico ceded the territory. And the last third of the United States was thus won by war with Mexico, which is itself a former colony of Spain. And thus the dream of Manifest Destiny was fulfilled, as the U.S. achieved a national homeland that stretched from sea to shining sea, all across the continent, as the men who had written and defended the Constitution had envisioned. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in February 1848, which was an election year. Dun dun dun! Entering the spring and summer of a presidential election year. So exciting. Remember from the start of this lecture that 1844 had seen James K. Polk and the Democrats win the presidency on the platform of territorial expansion against the Whig Henry Clay, who took important chunks of New England and the Old Northwest. The Whigs could still also get votes in the Upper South and border states, which benefited from the transportation improvements and judicial framework of the federal power. By 1848, the regional divisions were even more clear. Westward expansion, in the form of the annexation of Texas and winning the war with Mexico, was creating internal divisions in the political parties around the issue of slavery, new states, and representation in Congress. I've described here how the Wilmot Proviso had opened up divisions not only between Southern and Northern Democrats, but also between the Northern barn burners, who radically opposed slavery, and the Northern doughfaces, who didn't much care about the issue and wanted to keep it out of public debates. As the Democratic Party was dissolving into these different groups, so too was the Whig Party falling into pieces. This little sliver of the vote was a whole 10% of the population, the white male population, who voted for a new party called Free Soil, and many of its members were former Whigs. One of these was David Wilmot, who left the Democratic Party in disgust after the failure of his proviso. The Free Soilers took the Whigs, who wanted federal infrastructural support for free white settlers in the West, and Democratic abolitionists who wanted the same. They were united by their desire to preserve the West for free men. So, men who had been Whigs were leaving the party and voting for a third party, the short-lived Free Soil Party that was seriously abolitionist, but not in the style of those who sympathized with slaves. Remember when I spoke about the numerous different reasons for being abolitionist in the white northern middle class? The Free Soil voters were abolitionists because they wanted to preserve opportunity for themselves and people who were like themselves, for ordinary white men, not the rich slave owners who dominated politics in the southern states. The Free Soil Party wanted one major thing, that the new states of the West would be free, not slave, a chance for the small farmer to gain land and farm, rather than the big planter with a bunch of money tied up in his slaves. You can see this in their iconography, their imagery. Here's the farmer with his plow, farming his own land. The dream of westward expansion to the Free Soil Party. This poster supports candidates in the 1848 election. Here's another one, with the farmer and his plow at the bottom. And at the top of the poster, you can see the classic imagery of the Federalists, the big government guys who wrote the Constitution. Here's the eagle of the central federal government and the columns. This indicates that the new Free Soil Party spoke mostly to former Whigs, who had always wanted government support to help farmers sell their goods, canals and internal improvements, roads and banks, as well as tariffs to finance this economic growth. And at the bottom, the Free Soil image again, the farmer and his plow. Free Soil stood for cheap land sold from the federal holdings to small farmers. Pro-tariff, meaning they were pro-industry, and support, above all, for free labor. Free soil, free labor, free men. This was the anti-slavery arm of the American body politic. Free Soil was full of anti-slavery former Whigs who had themselves come out of the Federalists. And in 1848, the Free Soil Party took 10% of the vote. We see the first stirrings of political realignment in this short-lived Free Soil Party that took so many votes from the old Whig Party, as well as some of the anti-slavery barn burner Democrats. The party system was under strain. Then came the gold rush, which spurred westward expansion all the way to the newly acquired territory of California. It began in 1848, and the flood of westward expansion continued through 1849. Gold was discovered in California in 1848, and people dashed across the country as fast as they could, sometimes going by ship and sometimes overland. When they arrived, they became known as the 49ers for their date of arrival. Yes, the San Francisco 49ers are named for the gold rush. More than 250,000 people arrived in California and shifted the whole center of population further west, shaping American culture and history. Most people headed to California over the Overland Trail, which was really a whole array of possible trails for getting from the Midwest across the plains, often in their covered wagons, to arrive in California and mine for gold or to serve the people who did. The classic imagery of American history, the covered wagons, the Overland Trail, a huge accomplishment, and another episode of Manifest Destiny and the movement of population into the West in the 1848-1850 period. With that much population, Californians decided to seek admission to the United States in 1850. And this was perfect. Since Texas had been annexed as a slave state, admitting California as a free state would reestablish the balance in the Senate. Remember, this had been the goal of Henry Clay when he crafted the Compromise of 1820 to keep the balance in the Senate between free states and slave states. So now he wrote a new compromise with this in mind, to extend the border between slave states and free states established in 1820 in a way that reflected the new reality, the Mexican Cession, and the annexation of Texas as a slave state. The Compromise of 1850 was another chance to extend the promises made by the Compromise of 1820, and Henry Clay was the man responsible for them both. He wrote the Compromise of 1850 as an omnibus bill, meaning it was like a bus, the kind you ride on. It carried a lot of things. First of all, the basics. California's admission to the Union as a free state, a state prohibiting slavery in the state, would balance the annexation of Texas as a slave state. Texas abandoned its claims north of the 3630 line because the Compromise of 1820 had forbidden slavery above it. New Mexico territory was below that line, and Utah territory was above it, but the Compromise of 1850 said that each one of those territories could determine its own status when the time came, when they sought statehood. This part of the 1850 Compromise contradicted the earlier one, the 1820 Compromise, as it contained the possibility that a state above the designated line would permit slavery. It was motivated by a doctrine called popular sovereignty, which was a term invented in the late 1840s and adopted by a Democratic senator from Michigan, a dough-faced Democrat named Lewis Cass, as a response to the Wilmot Proviso. Popular sovereignty said that new states could decide for themselves whether or not they wanted to permit slavery within their borders. The Compromise of 1850 applied the popular sovereignty doctrine to these new territories. It upheld the Missouri Compromise for the unorganized territories above the 3630 line and prohibited slavery in these regions of the Northwest. But future states west of that line could decide for themselves. Since Utah and New Mexico were territories where it is dry and mountainous, they were assumed unfriendly to plantation agriculture with its broad fields growing monocrop commodities for export or use in factories. Another part of this 1850 compromise was the Fugitive Slave Act, which promised that federal troops would support the capture and return of slaves who had fled to free states. This put the might of the federal government and the National Army behind the slave owners, even in free states. Northern citizens also resented paying to support the policemen and military soldiers who were working to return property to people down in the South, people with already too much power over the federal government, in the eyes of the abolitionist middle-class Northerners. You can see, too, that for free people of color, this was a terrifying change, as they could risk being kidnapped and returned to the South. Once there, how to prove you're actually free? Basically, any person of color could be seized by a slave dealer, who could claim him as a fugitive and take them south to sell at a profit. The result was sometimes rioting in the streets when bystanders in northern cities tried to free slaves that had been captured for return. This provision of the compromise was intended to please Southerners. In exchange for the abolitionist North, the 1850 Compromise promised to end the slave trade in Washington, D.C. This was a promise made to relieve those abolitionist members of Congress who were sickened by hearing the chants of human auctions through the open windows of the sweltering D.C. summers. If they didn't have to hear it, maybe they could forget about it, this villainous business at the heart of American democracy. The 1850 Compromise. Peace, again, between the sections. The 1852 election, pictured here, presented a last breath of relief before the crisis really broke into the open. Look at it. It looks like complete agreement. Would you guess that this nation would be embroiled in a bloody civil war in less than a decade? Here we go. Part 2. Election of 1852. Franklin Pierce, nominated by the Democrats, carried almost every state. The Whigs nominated Winfield Scott, superstar general of the Mexican War, and they still managed to get only a sliver of the Electoral College, and won a few states outright. This was the effective end of the Whig Party, and with it, the end of the second party system, as Whig voters switched to voting for a number of small parties that were emerging to answer specific needs and address specific issues. Here, you can see that the Free Soil Party achieved only 5% of the popular vote, half the proportion of the previous election. In 1848, the Free Soilers had taken 10% of the votes cast. In 1852, the Free Soil Party took only 5% of the vote. That's how it usually goes in American politics. A third party, outside the two dominant parties, makes its strongest showing the first time it fields a candidate, but then it fades thereafter. And so with the Free Soilers. They took part of the constituency away from the Whigs and some former Democrats, barn burners who could no longer sit comfortably with the Southern slave owners, or the dough-faced Democrats who appeased them, their view. But the Free Soil Party wasn't broad enough in its appeal to win more support than that. The peace of the 1852 election was shattered almost immediately when Kansas and Nebraska applied to enter the Unionist states. Remember, both of these territories were above the 3630 line that the 1820 Compromise had agreed would keep them as free states. Not slave states, but free. That was agreed to back in 1820. But as settlers streamed into Kansas and Nebraska, the question seemed open. The Compromise of 1850 had opened up the issue with its concept of popular sovereignty. The territories were also directly west of Missouri, a slave state, and many settlers came from there and brought slaves with them, and thus Kansas became a battleground between free soil and pro-slavery advocates. And when I say battleground, I mean it. Guerrilla warfare, a little predecessor to the Civil War called Bleeding Kansas. Congress made the fight over the territories legitimate when it passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. The Kansas-Nebraska Act effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise by extending popular sovereignty to these territories at the moment when they sought their statehood. If popular sovereignty allowed each state to determine its own status as a free or a slave state, then people in the territory on opposite sides of the issue were going to have to decide for themselves. And when you ask the American people to compromise on a major issue, it's complicated and often violent. In Kansas, open warfare broke out as the territory tried to decide whether it would enter the Union as a free or as a slave state. Clearly, there were outsiders at work in trying to determine if Kansas would be slave or free. For example, in the 1855 elections for the territorial legislature, a necessary step toward becoming a state of the Union, 6,000 people cast votes. However, there were only 1,500 legal voters in the territory, so 3/4 of the votes were cast by people who were not really invested in the outcome. Pro-slavery people from Missouri had crossed the border and swelled the ranks of voters, and they were known as border ruffians. Border ruffians were those people from Missouri who crossed over into the Kansas territory and voted in elections there, though they were not settlers. And they were generally pro-slavery ideologues, caught up in the belief about the natural superiority of white men, and determined to preserve the power of white men in the new state. Their illegal actions created a pro-slavery majority in the territorial legislature, and they began immediately to pass a bunch of pro-slavery laws, establishing property rights for slave owners and explicitly forbidding free blacks from settling in the territory. The outraged settlers of Kansas called a constitutional convention in 1855 to try to reverse this pattern. The actual settlers were mostly free soilers and wanted the state to continue to sell small farms to modest farmers to farm on their own, not big planters with lots of slaves. So the free soil settlers of Kansas called an 1855 convention in Topeka, Kansas, to write a constitution that forbade slavery in the new state. The free soilers wrote a constitution in Topeka and petitioned for admission to the United States under these terms. The President of the U.S. took the other side. President Franklin Pierce denounced the Free Soilers of Kansas as traitors and supported the pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri. Franklin Pierce had great hair for the 19th century. He was a heavy drinker who always voted the straight Democratic Party line, a safe president for a party in a difficult position. But in the case of the controversy over Kansas, and who counted as a person when the time came for representative self-government, he supported the pro-slavery activists. The federal marshal gathered a posse of border ruffians from Missouri and went to Lawrence, Kansas, where they sacked the government buildings, burned the governor's house, destroyed the newspaper's printing presses in an attempt to suppress the Free Soil view. Here's the news coverage of the time, engravings from the newspapers before photography was a thing, the image of the burned-down capital of a U.S. territory. This was the beginning of the Bleeding Kansas crisis. The burned-down capital inspired a violent response on the part of some Free Soiler settlers, especially John Brown, a violent, seriously religious man who had moved to Kansas specifically to fight the pro-slavery movement there. With his sons, who are also evangelical Christians and radical abolitionists, he responded to the sack of Lawrence by slaughtering 5 pro-slavery settlers and displaying their mutilated bodies. There was a guerrilla war between pro-slavery and free soil advocates in Kansas as it sought its statehood, and we call this Bleeding Kansas. And while John Brown represented the most extreme wing of American abolition, dreaming of a violent end to slavery, this seems to be how social movements work. Those that are more extreme make the more moderate people seem normal. If, once upon a time, William Lloyd Garrison had been the radical abolitionist by calling for immediate emancipation, he began to look more moderate, as violent men like John Brown murdered pro-slavery settlers in the name of the same cause. We'll meet him again towards the end of the lecture, but let's get back to Kansas. Slave state or free? The pro-slavery advocates who had burned down the capital of the territory at Lawrence declared that the new capital of the state was 12 miles away at Lecompton. And they met there to write a new constitution that permitted slavery in the state. The pro-slavery advocates wrote the Lecompton Constitution, and the two sides each held an election for their own constitution. Remember, the Lecompton Constitution of 1857 supported slavery, while the Topeka Constitution of 1855 outlawed the importation of slaves into the new state. Each side held its own vote, so both constitutions passed and were sent up to D.C. as the proposed Constitution of Kansas when Kansas became a state. Between the Topeka Constitution of 1855 and the Lecompton Constitution of 1857, there had, of course, been another presidential election. And Bleeding Kansas was one of those violent episodes that all political candidates use to make points and support their view of the world, like a pandemic, or a financial downturn, or a military crisis. So all this story of Bleeding Kansas was told and retold by the political parties as part of the build-up to the election of 1856. Different versions of current events circulated among different groups of people across the nation, as the political fights were breaking out into violence, even far from the frontier. For example, in May 1856, Charles Sumner, a senator from Massachusetts and a firm abolitionist, delivered a speech in the U.S. Senate called The Crime Against Kansas. I'm going to read some of it to you right now. Against this Kansas territory, thus fortunate in position and population, a crime has been committed. It is the rape of a virgin territory, compelling it to the hateful embrace of slavery. And it may be clearly traced to a depraved longing for a new slave state, the hideous offspring of such a crime, in the hope of adding to the power of slavery in the national government. End quote. This language recalled the sexual abuse of female slaves, which I spoke of in an earlier lecture, a strong theme of the abolitionist viewpoint, but designed to create maximum rage in the part of the pro-slavery ideologues who believed that mastery was patriarchal and therefore fundamentally benevolent and kind. Senator Sumner claimed the issue was bigger than the violence in Kansas, and that the contest, quote, will soon be transferred to a broader stage where every citizen will be not only spectator, but actor, end quote. In response, Senator Sumner received the rage he expected. The day after Charles Sumner delivered this speech, The Crime Against Kansas, in the Senate, a congressman from South Carolina went to the Senate chamber and raised his cane above his head and beat Charles Sumner down. Remember what South Carolinians say about their state: too small to be its own country, too large to be a mental institution. They pride themselves on being hot-headed, or at least the white males do. Here they are, on the floor of the U.S. Senate, witnessing the attack, all rushing toward the fight. And here's the cartoon. Obviously, from the northern perspective, Sumner clutches his quill pen while Preston Brooks, the South Carolina senator, beats him down with a cane. The cartoon says this is Southern chivalry. Luckily, Preston Brooks' fashionable cane was made of gutta percha, that natural rubber, and so it was brittle and broke apart as a weapon over Sumner's head and shoulders, disintegrating before it could kill him. But it did damage him. He did not return to the Senate floor for months, and everywhere Preston Brooks went after that, he was a celebrity and asked to give talks about those horrible northern elites with their abolitionist views, and when he spoke, people often gave him a new, commemorative cane, sometimes engraved with the words, "Hit him again." The nation was falling apart. These were events that were occurring in the spring and summer, heading toward the 1856 presidential election. In 1856, you can see that the second-party system had fallen almost entirely apart, that the parties had become representatives of the North or the South, not crossing those lines. The old Whig Party, founded by Henry Clay, stalwart of the second-party system, took only 22% of the vote and only 3% of the Electoral College. The Whigs were gone as a political force. They're linked here to the Know-Nothing Party. This was the anti-immigrant crowd, drawing a lot of the working-class whites in the northern cities. Remember that some of the Whigs, like David Wilmot, had become Free Soilers, while others voted for the American Party, and this was the party that hated immigrants more than anything. Remember, the anti-Irish, anti-immigrant view of the 1840s. In the 1850s, this coalesced into a new party, a kind of secret society. If a member were asked about the party, he was supposed to reply, "I know nothing," hence the nickname, the Know-Nothing Party. The American Party didn't take a side on the issue of slavery, preferring to minimize its impact on the value of labor, and to emphasize instead the effect of immigration on the white working class. They believed that Catholic immigrants were ruining American Protestant culture, and their votes for a fringe political party show that the traditional parties of the second-party system, the Democrats and the Whigs, were fragmenting. They could no longer hold their members together across different issues. The Democrats chose James Buchanan from Pennsylvania as their candidate. He had been an ambassador to England during the events of 1856, Bleeding Kansas, John Brown's abolitionist violence, the caning of Sumner, so he had managed to avoid taking any controversial stands. He became known as a Northern man of Southern principles, and it was hoped by the Democrats that he could therefore cross party lines, and in fact, he won the election. From Pennsylvania, without any particular record on the issue of slavery in the Western Territories, and known to appreciate Southern principles, including the pro-slavery ideology, President James Buchanan was a man for all seasons. But pay attention to the other candidate, who did not win. This was Representative John C. Fremont, an explorer of the far West, with no political experience, nominated by a party, the Republicans, that hadn't even existed 4 years earlier. And yet, he won 33% of the vote, all of it in the North. The Republicans were part of the former Whigs, not the anti-immigrant wing, not the Free Soil Party, but the big business side, that Federalists had always supported, from the days of Hamilton's financial plan and, for that matter, since the ratification of the Constitution. The Republicans were the purest version of the former Whigs, and before them, the Federalists. The Republicans supported internal improvements, tariffs, the business agenda, and the federal support for enterprise that had always been an important element of Whig ideology. Big government in support of business, trade, and capital investment. That was the Whig agenda that persisted into the brand new Republican Party. Buchanan won. By the time he took office in 1857, the country was experiencing a significant economic downturn. A depression following the Crimean War, and the question of Kansas had not yet been resolved. It was in the year of 1857, the year of Buchanan's inauguration, that the pro-slavery settlers wrote the Lecompton Constitution. It was in this year of 1857 that Kansas sent both a pro-slavery and an anti-slavery constitution to the United States in the bid for statehood. And President Buchanan declared the Lecompton Constitution the valid one, which would make Kansas a slave state. This was the destruction of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and the end of the fragile balance in the Senate, as supported by the new president and the new administration. The planter aristocracy was gaining strength in the federal government, and it had never been weak, not since the ratification of the Constitution that gave the slave owners extra votes in the 3/5 clause, an extra vote for every 3 out of 5 people that a white male kept enslaved. The crisis sharpened. 2 days after Buchanan's inauguration, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down its decision in the Dred Scott case. Some quick background. Dred Scott was the name of a man enslaved in Missouri who had been taken into the North by his master, and he sued for his freedom in the Missouri courts. He argued that he had been in a free state, and so the laws there meant he was no longer a slave. Then his owner died, and he became the property of his old master's wife's brother, who happened to be an abolitionist in New York. It was the fact that he'd been taken across state lines that made this a matter of interstate commerce, and therefore something the federal courts and the Supreme Court could decide. And, in its ruling, the Supreme Court delivered a stunning defeat for the abolitionist view. The Supreme Court made clear that it wasn't just that Dred Scott lost in his bid for freedom. It was even more dramatic than that. Property can't sue. How can a non-person sue? That's why we spend so much time in this course thinking about what it means to be a person, to own property, to make contracts, to buy a car, take a job. Only people can sue and be sued. And Dred Scott was property, not a person in the eyes of the law. He had no rights even to bring a case to court. The response was furious. This was the most extreme pro-slavery position, and it seemed supported by the new president and by the Supreme Court, by every branch of government. The Southerners were elated, and the North was dismayed. Then came midterm elections. I'll talk more about the midterms of 1858 in the next lecture, but in these midterms, the debate on slavery versus abolition broke wide open in the debates between Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln. By this point, slavery was the daily concern of the nation, part of every political discussion, and a huge strain on the political system. Into this mix stepped, once again, John Brown from Kansas. This is an album cover from the rock band Kansas, not a primary source historical document, but it captures his violent abolitionist view. John Brown and his sons had decided, as a result of their failures in Kansas, to start a slave revolt, to take over the federal government that had now been revealed as a pro-slavery institution, their view. He went to Virginia, to the Harper's Ferry Armory, a federal armory where guns were made and stored for the army. He and his followers seized the armory on October 16, 1859. They were besieged by federal troops under Robert E. Lee. That raid was 3 weeks before the presidential election. John Brown failed to get the slaves armed and fighting, and he was seized, tried, and then hanged in December, along with 6 of his followers. The white Southerners feared slave revolts, and this time they were able to attach their terrors to the Republican political party that seemed so inimical to their views. Both sides thought the federal government worked against them. Both sides were willing to use violence to support their views. This is the context for the election of 1860, which is where I'll pick it up next time. Remember, I've always argued that the Civil War was about slavery, which didn't mean that the North was morally superior and sympathetic to the enslaved. Quite the contrary. The political issue was at least partly about freedom for white men, which many Americans in the North had come to believe was threatened by the expansion of slavery into the West. The political parties now represented distinct regions of the country, regions with different economic systems, different ways of life, and the differences between the regions, based around the locations and the questions of slavery.